next we have Anna de Jong. She is a senior lecturer from University of Glasgow, Scotland, and she will be talking to us about what is the role of justice in tourism development. So please, Anna, go ahead.
Thank you. Cheers. I'll just work out my screen share. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I think that's in full screen.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be presenting something that's quite new for me today. It's not empirical research, but rather some ideas that we've been thinking about with colleagues about how we might go again about constructing some form of theoretically informed evaluation framework in order to think about and capture the justices and potential injustices that come about through tourism development, particularly in peripheral regions. I don't work in the Arctic context, but I think I was invited here today because the west of Scotland, the Lochaber and Skye region, are captured within this broader project, and many of the ways that we've been thinking about this framework is influenced through some of the challenges that have been experienced within the Scottish Highlands. So tourism as a rural development tool is, of course, central to certain UK and also EU policies. And this really is largely on reflection because of the perceived job creation potential that comes from tourism and the way that it's understood to counter structural problems related to population and industrial decline, and is kind of perceived, I suppose, to provide responses to issues such as a lack of attractive employment opportunities, skills shortages, underinvestment, and youth drain. So rural development, in consequence, is often positioned as a way to achieve balanced territorial development of economies and communities, and as such provide a lot of economic support is provided for regions within the UK, particularly those in peripheral areas. But importantly, of course, there's often a lack of assessment on rural development policy regarding how the actual outcomes of tourism development and how that actually leads to a decrease in social inequalities within specific geographical areas, as well as there often being omissions around understanding the complex relationship of the tourism industry in relation to the broader place, as well as these broader processes that Deirdre was talking about in the previous presentation. But these omissions are perhaps really ironic, given that if development means anything, it is that it must render clear improvement for the lived experiences for those who are living in the areas in the regions in which development is taking place. And this is why tourism as a development tool really needs to be understood through an ethical lens, as well as through these broader processes that are currently being experienced in many of the UK and Europe's tourism dominant peripheral regions, whereby the high cost of building homes and the lack of available land in many tourism dominant regions is coupled with shifts in consumer demand away from traditional tourism products and towards self-governed experience and self-catered short-term rentals, all of which are intersecting to really work together to render pressures on both cultural landscapes and environmental landscapes. These issues, particularly on the Isle of Skye, where we've been looking at some of the challenges that come about through rural development in peripheral regions, often come out through experiences of housing and services. So where in the absence of sufficient and affordable permanent accommodation and services, there is kind of evidence of long-term residents continuing to move away despite the tourism investment, which really render challenges in the ability of these regions to retain the unique cohesiveness that comes about through the situatedness of long-term communities, risking the loss of the very cultural heritage that makes these places meaningful regions to live and visit. Such dynamics also ensure that long-term residents are less able to contribute to the future of our regions through community building, and are less able to also capitalise on tourism growth through entrepreneurial and employment opportunities, all of which again really brings to question the potential of tourism as an inclusive development strategy in its current form, whilst also raising broader ethical concerns around intergenerational belonging and placemaking, and also our right to live in the places in which we grew up. And this also speaks to ethical kind of tensions around hypermobility and situatedness, which was also mentioned in the previous presentation. So recognising the complexities of these challenges, tourism researchers and practitioners have, of course, increasingly sought to engage with political agendas that attempt to re-establish tourism as socially and environmentally just. And there are various directions that this work has taken, although broadly they have tended to be framed through the broad concept of sustainable tourism and its many descendants. So thinking here about community-based tourism, ecotourism, responsible tourism, and so on, and all of which work together to create a way to respond to these issues differently. But of course, these alternative approaches have been met with several criticisms from academics, and I of course won't go into them all today, but just to touch on a couple that are particularly relevant here in this space. So one of the challenges is that alternative forms of tourism do tend to be perceive tourism and conceptualize tourism as discrete forms, with focus often on individual products or individual projects, which are somewhat dislocated from the specificities of places and the realities of those interconnections, both at the local level and across scales, which can create challenges for really understanding the justice or the ethics that's connected to tourism development. There's often, it's very difficult to get away from the continued pressure on quantifying tourism success through visitor numbers and through economic spend, even though the ethos, the original impetus for these projects and products is so far removed from those measures. And also, finally, there's often limited engagement with the experiences of those located within tourism landscapes that are arguably made most marginalised through tourism development. And this is because it's very difficult to really capture the experiences of those who are marginalised through tourism development, because they're often technically not explicitly connected to the tourism industry whilst being influenced by it. So there have been several calls from tourism academics to identify a framework to unite concerns relating to tourism development that really captures the interrelatedness of tourism as a situated lived experience that's entangled with diverse social, political, and economic systems. So justice as a concept and potential framework has been gaining increasing interest among tourism researchers in recent years, where justice here is very broadly refers to and attempts to ensure that the benefits of tourism development are evenly spread and that marginalised groups and vulnerable environments are not adversely impacted by tourism development. And justice as a concept has been seen as valuable in the sense that there's an idea within the literature that it inherently points to the interwovenness of tourism with society, with politics, environment, and it recognises that development affects people differently in different ways that can produce inequalities. And these inequalities need to be assessed, captured, if we are going to be assessing the effectiveness of tourism development policies. This ethical ideal of tourism development as needing to account for local communities and environments has, of course, consistently run through tourism academic discussions, right? As long as tourism has been discussed as an academic area. So this is definitely nothing new here. In 95, for example, Glucksmann referred to this notion of just tourism in relation to ethical behaviour among service providers and marketers, where, quote, they shared, if service providers view tourism first as a business and second as an experience and ethical practice, tourism ceases to be just by becoming an industry, unquote. But whilst value has long been given to the concept, and there's been increasing discussions around this notion of just tourism or a justice approach to tourism, there remains no conceptual framework that really identifies how we might go about thinking, kind of utilising a justice framework. Whilst Guer just last year in 21 argued that more needs to be done to reclaim the potential of justice tourism amidst the proliferation of the different forms of sustainable and alternative tourism, as well as the global machinery of the tourism industry. So in response, or kind of building on these ideas, we've been thinking about what a justice framework might actually look like. And here we've been partly informed and attempting to somewhat extend the work of political geographer Edward Soja to propose kind of three approaches that would be intersected to present a spatial justice framework to really capture tourism development as both a place-based lived experience that's also very much informed through these broader processes. So first here, we're proposing the need for a political economy approach. And here the political economy approach really attempts to capture this idea that tourism is part of broader social, political and economic processes, where through our political economy approach, tourism is understood to be political, whereby shifts in tourism's production and consumption are conceived as political acts that are carried out by social groups with managerial and elite interests. And tourism on this view becomes conceived as interconnected to the broader context of a globalizing world, whereby tourist destinations are entwined with other places through the tourism development decision-making process in ultimately ways that shape geographical differences. So here, insights would be gained through, say, interviews with key decision makers across scales. So we're looking at the Isle of Skye context, for example. This would take place at the level of Skye and perhaps even the level of certain clustered areas within Skye. But then, of course, at the Highland level, Scottish level, UK, and also to capture that legacy of influence of development in focus would also be like the EU level potentially as well. And also there could be value in policy media analysis to also capture the policies themselves, as well as the interviews to capture the kind of politics and decision-making processes within that. So whilst valuable, a political economy approach would not be enough to interrogate tourism's injustices. And this is really because a political economy approach takes focus with a more macro perspective in how those with power influence decision-making processes. And as a result, focus tends to be with the decision makers as opposed to gaining in-depth insight into the experiences of individuals who are connected to tourism at the local scale, and as well those made most vulnerable to the development of tourism within distinct locations. So here we've been thinking about this role of this introduction of a feminist approach to complement the political economy approach, to really capture the micro level lived experiences of justice, with focus being with individuals made most vulnerable, as well as the tourism industry, as I mentioned. And here, again, going back to this idea of this balance between universal ethics and the individual, the way we've been thinking about it is that this lived experience feminist approach would really be valuing here a relative approach to ethics, where rather than thinking of prescriptive ideas around what might be just or unjust, focus becomes on the individual lived experience in this place and in specific places, and how individuals are able to navigate the life course and key decision-making transition points within the tourism dominant region, and it's how they would define these experiences and challenges themselves. So here, drawing on, say, interviews and ethnography and extended periods of knowing how these places work and the variations and experiences within places. So here again, the feminist approach would be heavily informed from a geographical, spatial, place-based approach that would complement that feminist approach there. So in synthesizing political economy with a feminist and geographical approach, we're thinking that we could provide some insight into both the lived experiences of injustice, particularly for those made most vulnerable through tourism development in specific places at the micro level, whilst at the same time generating understandings of tourism's interwovenness with politics and society and economies at this macro level. So that, as you can see here, is very early days in thinking about these ideas, but obviously it's a really political area and something that the tourism industry is kind of discussing itself and needing, and reflects the current state of play within the industry itself, whilst also reflecting the direction of travel within the academic discussions relating to tourism development. And so hopefully this gives a sense of how we're thinking about bringing these ideas together. And that's all I have for today. Thanks so much for listening.